right. Well, I would like to welcome everyone here to this Zoom conversation with our amazing guest, author and historian Lynell George. And my name is Dennis Bartok. I'm the executive director for the Philosophical Research Society. And we're here tonight to talk with Lynell about this truly amazing book that she wrote, A Handful of Earth, A Handful of Sky, The World of Octavia E. Butler, which we've actually had on sale for several months. You can buy it at the PRS bookstore or online. I encourage everyone, if you don't have it, please purchase a copy. And I would also, before we begin, like to say an enormous thanks to Jim Schneeweiss and everyone at Angel City Press who published this fantastic book. So, Lynell, my first question is when did you first discover Octavia E. Butler's writing, and what were the first works of hers that you read?
First off, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here. We've been trying to do this for a while, and I really have been looking forward to it. So I would like to say that first. As for discovering Octavia, my mother was a high school English teacher. She taught junior high school and then later high school. So I grew up with her bookcases at home that were full of the things she was reading, and also the books that she would give to students. And Octavia was on those shelves. And so I knew the name before I knew who she was. And then when I got older, my mother was really interested in her as a figure, Black woman writing science fiction. And so we went to probably, I think the first time I saw her read was probably at Esalen bookstore, which is sadly now closed, and also at the also great and now closed Midnight Special bookstore in Santa Monica. And I have such a clear memory of her walking in, and she probably had gotten off the bus, with her purse and her papers, and she announced to the crowd, I'm not going to read, because I think at the first time she didn't say she was dyslexic, and she was never diagnosed formally, but she had figured it out. So she didn't like to do public reading. So instead, what she would do would talk. And so she talked about writing in her books, and I literally was just inches away from her, at the smaller Midnight Special and the smaller Esalen. And it was that was my first impression of her, and then later, as I became a journalist, as I was moving into that world, I would see her at panels and conventions and things like that. And so it was just interesting to watch her as my writing career, shifted and turned into, I was always interested in writing, but I didn't know where I wanted to go. And so it was interesting watching her career build as mine was taking shape.
And did you ever get a chance to speak with her at any of these events, or your mother? Did she get a chance to talk with her?
Yes, both of us. I had forgotten when I was doing my first research in the Huntington, I pulled my edition of Parable of the Sower off my shelf, and I forgot that she had signed it to me. So I have the signature. I mean, I remember standing in line, but I didn't realize that she had my name is in it and everything. So that was very moving. But I had the last time I saw her alive was in 2004 in Seattle. I went to the Black to the Future Festival, and she gave the keynote, and I wandered up to her. I was writing a story about the festival, and I asked her, I pulled her aside and asked her, will you be coming down to LA? I'd like to, interview you. And she said, oh yes, I'll be down. And of course she died 2 years later. And that was my last chance to speak with her. And so I have a lot of regret about, not being able to do a formal interview. So being in the archive has been such a gift to be with her.
But you did actually discover this signed message,
Yes.
forgotten from her
Yes.
to
Yes.
you.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Maybe
Yeah.
interpret that as her blessing or benediction from years
Absolutely.
past, like you will be able to help tell my story to another
Yes.
generation, which is
Yeah.
really wonderful.
Yeah. What a gift that was. I really, yeah, you're right. It was like, a little message, like stay on the path,
And did you start with the books of hers that your mother had on the shelf? Did your mother recommend things to you, or what were the first ones what was your kind of the gateway drug, I guess I would say, to
Yeah.
Octavia's writing for you?
Actually, the book I picked up, and this is so typically me, it was Kindred, because I didn't think of myself as a science fiction fan. But I was interested in books about history and books about time travel, which is still, and Kindred really spoke to me. I mean, just the idea of somebody slipping through time. And as Octavia said later, I mean, often in interviews, she said, the book isn't science fiction. The book is, she goes, there is no machine, there is no science. Dana is, we don't know how Dana is moving through time. The main character who is snatched out of Pasadena of the 70s into the antebellum South, Maryland. And we don't know. But at a certain point in the beginning, you think it's going to be answered, but they're so pulled into the story and the history and how families are intertwined and how she's going to survive, that it doesn't matter anymore, and the metaphor becomes really clear that we haven't left. That history is with us.
Where did you begin with your research for the book? Once you decided, I'm going to write about Octavia, where did you start? And can you talk about accessing the treasure trove of over 8,000 items that are the Octavia E. Butler collection at the Huntington Library and Museum?
Yes, I was actually asked by Julia Meltzer, who is the founder of the arts nonprofit Clock Shop. And she was going to plan, and she wasn't sure what it was going to, but she had the name. She was going to want to call it Radio Imagination, and it was going to be this initiative that was going to help bring Octavia Butler back into the forefront, since the archive, it wasn't open yet. I think Julia and I had our first coffee back in 2014. And she said, would you be interested in, going into the archive? And I said, sure. And she said, to her mind, she thought she'd like me to do something that she called a posthumous interview. And I thought, okay, I'm not sure what that's going to look like. I wanted to make sure that I was doing something that was serious, and I wasn't going to try to have a seance with Octavia. But once I got into the archive, it's so overwhelming, and I really wasn't sure where I was going to start. So I decided to go to the speech that she gave when I was in the room. I started there just to kind of ground myself. Right. And it was fascinating to hold these papers in my hand that were on the lectern that she had marked up, for her speech. And that gave me an idea about looking at her marginalia, looking at the things that were going on around the formal presentations that she gave. And when I was thinking about what interviews mean, interviews are always about access, and you want to, if you're going to do a really deep piece, you want to be able to have time, and you want the subject to feel comfortable speaking with you. And I kept thinking, how do I find that voice in the archive? Not looking at the manuscripts, not looking at her essays, not looking at her speeches even. And so I started to look in her diaries, and that was way very, 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 very personal. So I could get a sense of who was Octavia when she was at home. What was Octavia? Who was Octavia at 17 versus Octavia at 37? What was going on in her mind? And then again, to the marginalia. And the marginalia, she wrote all kinds of like details about not just how she's moving her characters in and out of their lives in the room and out of their problems that she was throwing at them, but she was writing about her own problems and her own challenges of did she have enough money to pay the bills? So you were looking at her calculations, her rent money, how much for food, how much for electricity, how much for this, her shopping lists, whatever she was watching on the news, she would make a note that she was going to go to the library and research it. Or so I got a sense of what her mind was like and what was going on all at the same time. So she's writing these books and she's also thinking about her life. And that's where I got the idea. That's what I want to write about. I want to write about what a writer's life is. And it's formal text and it's the stuff that goes on around the edges.
And I think that's what makes this such a fascinating book, because it really isn't your typical biography. It's very much about her creative process, how she became who she became. What were some of the most unexpected items that you came across? I'm sure everything was unexpected, but what were some of the ones that really jumped out at you? Like, oh, I never expected to look at this or uncover this. That also that really spoke to her work and who she was.
I think a couple of things. There are. I talk a lot about. Well, two things. I talk a lot about her calendars because they were interesting to me, because here's somebody who is dealing with the future. She's writing about the future. She's also writing about the past, and she's dealing with her present. So it was fascinating to look at these calendars that she created for some of her future work. So she would go and do research to figure out down to every detail what day of the week in 2058, like it would be on a Friday. And she created all this for every world that she was creating, and then she did it for her own personal world as well. So she had her deadlines, her immediate deadlines, and the things that were going to happen that day and the things that were going to happen down the week. And when I realized, like, this woman was in school, working a full-time job and writing. And I don't know how she got so much done in 24 hours, the same 24 hours everybody else had. She was able to bend time in that way too. So those are fascinating. And I always go back and look at her date books and her calendars. And the other thing, though, she was very creative, and there were times in her life where she was like, her mother would take in roomers to make money, renters, and so she didn't want anyone to look at her journals, because she was an avid diarist and journaler. And so she did things like she was taking a Spanish class, so she would write some of it. Like I would be reading something like, wait, she's writing in Spanish. And it was to keep people from knowing what she was writing about. She started giving people in her life other names so people didn't know. So there was all of this creative. So then I would think, well, who is she talking about? So I'd have to really start, looking and researching. And there's a hilarious item in there, which she calls the safe. And it's an old Laura Scudder's potato chip bag, the big size, which
Right.
he's created a secret envelope to hide whatever it is she's working on. So it might have been a personal letter or a manuscript. And she calls it the Pandora's box, and there's a warning, like if you open it, that something terrible will happen to you. So she was creative even in that part of her life as well. So that's one of my favorite things I stumbled upon.
That's amazing. And do they have the Laura Scudder's bag, or did
Oh
that?
yeah, the bag is in the archive. Yes.
That's
And I didn't know that it was coming. So when it came, I was like, wait, what is
this is the Pandora's box.
Pandora's box? I better not open it.
That's amazing. I know, it's just the curse is still on it, like Tutankhamun's tomb.
Yeah.
How did she structure her days? Because writers all have different structures. I think is maybe Stephen King talks about how he gets up early and will write, you know, X number of words or pages almost every day of his life in the morning. How was she able to study, work a full-time job, and write? When was she writing, or was it just throughout the day?
Yeah, she did a lot of different things, like during different periods of her life. So for example, like when she was in school and working and trying to write, very often what she would do would be get up at 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning and write, then finish, shower, get on the bus, go to school or go to work. Sometimes she'd write on the bus because she never drove. She was a bus rider her entire life. So she used that time to write and read. Also, and then sometimes if she had energy after she came home and had dinner, she might write a little bit so that when she woke up in the morning, that she could just dive into whatever it was. Once she was more established, she still kept up the morning writing routine. She may not always get up at 3 or 4, but she would get up early, do a little bit, then go for a walk or a hike up here in Altadena, and then come back and do a little bit more for a few hours before she would run her errands. But it's all plotted out too, like, you know, okay, I need to do, you know, X amount of hours, and then I need to do some desk work, and I probably should be with people a little bit. You know? But she tried to schedule that in as well.
That's amazing. Pasadena, which is where she grew up and spent much of her life, obviously was an enormous influence on her work, who she was. There's a great quote in your book, and I'm going to read some of the quotes both from you and from Octavia throughout. Hometown Pasadena, she once quipped, where everyone is rich, right? I'm guessing that was not her experience of
No.
Pasadena, but hers was an incredibly real and enriching one, because it also helped shape who she was in her writing. Can you talk a little bit about where she lived and how you think Pasadena, which is a place of great disparity, enormous. I mean, I'm sure everyone who's in Angelina knows, enormous mansions, enormous, very conspicuous, old money.
Yes.
On display. How did that shape her?
I think that, you know, she definitely, and as a young girl, her mother was a domestic. She was a maid who, her dad died when she was a baby, and so her mother was the sole breadwinner. So part of Octavia's life was living in, you know, a part of Pasadena that was not as wealthy, you know, and she knew working class, and then she would sometimes go with her mother into these homes, you know, these mansions, you know, and that marked her. And she said because she would notice that her mother would be different sometimes around these people that she was working for, and that bothered her, made her uncomfortable, that she was being deferential. And even though she did begin to understand, well, this is how she's surviving, so this is how she's putting bread on the table. The other thing that happened, though, is that her mother was extremely resourceful. And when her daughter expressed that she wanted to be a writer and she liked reading, her mother would bring home books that were discards and journals, and things for Octavia to have. So she benefited from some of this because her mother was paying attention. But yes, absolutely, this is something that she observed because she talks a lot about her powers of observation, and those lines of class and race were just indelible, in her mind. And she talked a lot about not being comfortable. And there's this heartbreaking scene in an essay that she's writing about where there's this bookstore or where she's buying comic books, and she actually has to ask the clerk, is it okay for kids to come in? But she means Black kids, and
Right.
yeah, so but all of this, goes into a pot, for her, and it informs how she's thinking about place, and how, her family who, migrated here from the South, and her mother talks about, being Louisiana cautious, in terms of, making sure, like, let's not step over these lines. And Octavia wanted to be bold. Octavia wanted to, even though she considered herself timid, Octavia wanted to dream bigger than what she was seeing, around her.
It's funny, and I want to talk a little bit more about this later in this story in particular, but when you're describing these mansions and the relationship between the families, the wealthy families, and her mother as a domestic, as a maid, I can't help thinking about Bloodchild and the relationship between the Talik alien overlords and the Terrans, the humans, which is a very complex relationship. It's not, it's not just clearly of oppressor and oppressed, as she herself said, but how did she know? Like, did you kind of discover in her journals, in her notebooks, was there an aha moment for her when she said, I want to be a writer? At what point in her life did she start thinking, hey, I could do this, and started to dedicate herself to it?
Couple things happen, and one of them, again, is her mother, who, and she talks about, and this is what I love, and I was just saying this to a friend last night, a writer friend last night, is that it's so important that some people may not understand your dreams, which her mother didn't fully. Like, you want to be a writer and you want to write science fiction, fantasy, but she understood what her daughter loved and what made her happy and what made her, I think, be able to float out of this kind of narrow notion of what it would be to be a Black woman in the 50s and 60s, in Pasadena. She could dream bigger. So her mother facilitated a lot of things, like taking her to the library and walking her to the library and signing up to, for a library card. She bought her first typewriter, Octavia, at 10, which other people in the family thought that's really extravagant, which I was like, why would you buy a child this professional machine? And it was like a huge, heavy Remington, I believe. And she didn't know what to do with it, but she knew it was serious, and it was, so these things were happening in the backdrop, but more specifically, Octavia, because when she started reading, she started making up her own stories, and then she would tell these stories that she would memorize to her mother. And then she said, one day, I realized I was forgetting my stories. And my mother said, well, you should write them down so you don't forget them. So that started the writing in the journals, and that, committing it to page. But she didn't realize being a writer was something you could get paid for. It took her a while to put all of this together. And she was watching a very bad B movie on television in the afternoon, I think she said, she was, I can't remember, it was Channel 5 or Channel 9, back in the day. But it was called Devil Girl from Mars. And she said at 12, she goes, I realized it was spectacularly bad and I could do better than that at 12. And that's what put her on the road to writing science fiction. And after that, there was no turning back. So that was definitely the aha moment.
That's such a beautiful remembrance of her mother buying her that typewriter, because it's like somebody buying the young Eric Clapton or Joni Mitchell a guitar. Like, now this is going to be your axe, this is going to be your guitar, and you're going to make this Remington sing. Amazing.
You're gonna do it.
So you've mentioned several times her in libraries. There's a wonderful clip that Liz Vasquez, our PR and social media manager, found from a BBC documentary that she posted of Octavia at the Pasadena Library. Is that right?
That's right.
Can you talk about her relationship with libraries, and why they were so special and what they meant to her and to her writing?
Yeah, I cannot tell you how often in archives and in interviews, I mean, honestly, it's one of the things that pretty much comes up all the time, how important libraries were to her, and that she couldn't possibly have been who she was without them. And she talks about libraries in essays being the open universities of America. And not only was it a place to go for her to read books as a kid, but it was also the places that she went to do research about careers, when she wasn't really sure, well, maybe I can't be a writer. So what can I do with the personality I have? I'm shy, I'm this. And she would actively go and research careers or job hunt or research her papers. And then she at the downtown public Central Library, it's where she wrote her first book. So, and later, well through her career, she would go to the Central Library as her office. And it was a place she could go and formally show up and sit down. She had a place to be and people knew her. And so it gave her community as well. So the idea that, and she says this, and she's like, this is why when we were having all those cutbacks in the 80s, 70s and 80s, and libraries were closing or limiting their hours. And she really actively, she was writing op-eds, and she was volunteering and teaching people to read, adults to read. She was just such a passionate supporter of public libraries, both here in Pasadena and in Los Angeles.
Did she know that her papers and her collection were going to go to the Huntington?
Yes, she actively, she put it in her will.
To me, that is one of the kind of great, miraculous, almost, it is a miracle and also this amazing contradiction. The Huntington is the great palace of libraries on the West Coast. I mean,
yes. Yeah.
It is perfect for Pasadena in a way, because it is so grand and so big and so opulent. Did she say anything in any of her writings about the fact that the Huntington, this grand edifice, would now be the home for so much of her private materials?
She didn't talk. I haven't seen anything in the archive except for the directives, but the woman who was the literary curator at that time, Sue Hodson, who's fantastic. I got to meet her years and years ago before the archive was open. When as a reporter, I was there doing something and she came over and we were chatting, and she told me, we're getting ready to open up her papers. And I was like, oh, this is so exciting. But Sue told me this wonderful story about how many years probably in the 80s, many years ago in the 80s, I think, where she went to see Octavia speak, and she was blown away. And she goes, and I knew nothing about her or science fiction, but I was so mesmerized by her that I got up and stood in line, and I put my hand out and shook her hand, and I gave her my card. And I said, have you figured out what you're going to do with your papers? And Octavia was like, no, what? And she says, I just want you to know that I'd love to talk to you, and I'm not going to push you, and I'm not going to nag you, and I'm not going to, but I want, if you want to have that conversation, we can. So some years pass, and Sue is the person who has to pick her up for a talk. And so she picks her up, and they in the car, and she said, and there was a moment where I was a little worried that I'm going to do it, and she said again, offer's still there if you're interested. And I think the third time she was at an event, and Sue said, I just walked up, I didn't say anything. And she said, I've already made arrangements. And I know it was Sue. I know that she would not have done that if Sue hadn't been who Sue is. And I think she trusted her and the kinds of conversations they had. And I think so for her, it wasn't just giving it to the Huntington, it was giving it to a curator who was going to be very careful with what she left. And Sue tells a story about, she was, and I was there the day, the papers arrive, and they arrive in a moving van. And she said it was very emotional because I thought I wouldn't live to be here to watch this happen. She died so young, like that. It was poignant that she was going to be the person actually going through the papers with Natalie Russell, wonderful curator, who actually was the person whose handwriting, if you're in the archive, you see Natalie's handwriting all throughout. So how I got to know Natalie, it was like, okay, Natalie's left me a little message here. But Sue and Natalie, worked together in the very beginning of trying to unpack all of that.
That's such a beautiful story about how Sue's relationship and kind of, long range but relentless pursuit of Octavia resulted in the Huntington getting her collection, which would be the crown jewel for almost any library or museum in the country now. But the fact that that collection is at this grand library in Pasadena where Octavia, but because of this very human, very personal relationship with Sue, not just, I want to give my papers to the grandest library in Pasadena. It's like, no, I know this woman, and she keeps gently hounding me, and
Exactly.
That's so wonderful. And that is so, I guess, Octavia E. Butler.
Yes, very, very much. And it's I was in the archive one day with Sue, and sometimes she comes in now as a reader, and I'm sitting at the desk next to her, they just happened to have seen us. And I opened one of those calendars I was talking about. This was one of her date books, and it actually has Sue's name, 11 a.m., Sue Hudson. So and I was like, oh my gosh. So I look, and reading room is extremely quiet. I went, and then I looked at her, and I turned to her, and she went, but there she was. There she was, there it was. And I said, do you want a photo of it? And she's like, no, that's okay. Okay, maybe I do.
I have to say, because you had such and synchronicities like that, you must have felt at some point that, did you ever feel like Octavia's presence? I'm not saying in a supernatural sense, but literally you see this note, and then you turn to the person whose name it is. That is such an amazing connection. Well, across time, as something Octavia wrote about. So did you ever feel her there as you were going through?
There were weird things that would happen. For example, sometimes I'd pull something and I'd open it and it would be the same day, it would be the same date, and I'm like, okay, so this is what was going on in her life then. I also, the way I found out that I actually live walking distance from one of her old homes, actually one of the places that Sue picked her up from. I didn't know that, I mean, I knew she lived in Pasadena, but I literally live in her old neighborhood. I drive past the market she shopped in, and the archive was the map. And that's what led me to understand, like, oh, okay, maybe I really am supposed to be doing this, because I would leave the archive with like a stack of addresses of things that she had talked about, and I would go to see, well, is that tree still growing? Because she was concerned about that tree. Oh yeah, she was right. They cut it down. It's gone. So there were things like that too. Yeah. So, but I absolutely, and other people there, we would be working in the archive, and sometimes, my friend Connie Samaras, the artist photographer who knew Octavia, sometimes she'd get up and she's like, look what I found. And it would be another thing, like same date or something that we had been trying to work out. It was there, so she was helping us, we would say.
Because so much of LA and Pasadena have changed, how much of the Pasadena that Octavia knew and grew up in remains in terms of her childhood homes, or like the market or the corner, or is most of it gone now?
A lot is gone. And she wrote really beautifully about not being sentimental, and I thought, and I'm the opposite. So, and she talked about how so many things have been, her old schools have been torn down, her old elementary schools, and some of her old homes. And she said, I can't cry about that. But there are, like the little place that's down on Washington, that's still there. Her libraries are still around. And I don't think she would be surprised that so much was gone. That's the other thing, because she seemed to be, like I said, she just seemed to be like, let's change. This is a woman who embraced change, and understood change.
So I'm going to read another short quote. The first is from you. I think it's a beautiful one. She knew that science fiction didn't have to be spaceships or superbugs. The most compelling science fiction for her offered readers alternative versions of not just the universe, but also of themselves. And Octavia herself said, surely a large part of my love for escapist literature comes from wanting to escape.
Yes.
Clearly, that's a theme that occurs and reoccurs through so much of her great fiction. What signs did you see of that wanting to escape, and what were the things that you think she wanted to escape from? Because she was, it seems from your portrait and from other accounts, a very solitary
Yes.
person for much of her life, childhood and adulthood.
I think there's so much during different periods, certain things would press on her more. One of the things is she didn't like Los Angeles. I just was rereading a quote of hers about, I just wish I could not be here, this place, home. And then she would talk about home, place, and home, her body, like she wanted to levitate out of all of it. But then she would talk later about how LA, Pasadena, these places, because of the friction, because, I was just saying to somebody the other night that parables of the sower wouldn't be parable of the sower, or parable of the talents wouldn't be parable of the talents, if she had not lived here and observed the sort of climate issues that we were experiencing here, like in that. So that's why she was able to render such a believable future, because she just extrapolated. She went into and figured out, like, well, what would it be in 30 years? What would it be like in 40 years? What would it be like? So even though that uncomfortableness, the wanting to leave, made her day-to-day life uncomfortable sometimes, a lot of the times, it also fueled her writing. Yeah, definitely. And she also, in the journaling, and that was the thing that I found to be so fascinating, was that because she was solitary, because she didn't like to, there's this great line, and I think about it all the time, like, keep your own counsel. Like she said, don't, she would tell herself, don't tell people what your problems are or what you really dream about, because they'll make you feel small. They'll tell you you're not so good. You don't need that in your head. You need to figure it. So she would actually use her journals, as she called it, moments for sessioning, and she would just get all of the negative thoughts out on the page. And these were different journals from her regular diaries or the commonplace books she was working on, in dealing with her actual writing. And she just would just deal with it there and then go back to it and resolve it. So I think those are the things that would help her resolve or calm the uncomfortableness of having to be in a place that she didn't want to be.
What kept her here so long? And 10 years before she died, she moved up to Seattle in the upper Northwest. And what finally prompted her to leave and move to Seattle?
Sadly, her mother's death. She stayed here to care for her mother because her mother had cared for her. And so she had lived in LA for a while. She'd moved out of Pasadena, was living in LA, but was coming back, of course, to be with her family and visit. She was a very attentive child, although, she also knew how to create space. So she had the time to write and think and work. But when her mother was older and became ill, and she was there to caretake, moved back to Pasadena. And after she died, that's when she decided she was going to make this move. And so when she sold her mom's house and sold her house, she moved up to the Seattle area.
So her mother lived long enough, though, to see the acclaim that her daughter had started to accrue, and that she was, successful and incredibly highly praised within that world. So she did get to experience that and see the payoff for her purchase of the typewriter.
Exactly. She did get to see that. And I am so grateful. Yeah, she got to see the MacArthur. She got to see, all of that.
That's amazing. There's another great quote from Octavia. There is a genius in us that we learn early to deny. How did she escape from that denial of her genius? Because it seems like there were so many factors that could have ground her down and kept that inside, and yet she had this incredible presence of mind and force of will, that she was willing not to deny her genius.
Right. She absolutely struggled with that for almost all of her life. She really, it got much better as she got older and with the acclaim, but there was always, and this is this thing about writers, and it's so recognizable, like anytime she would get blocked, like writer's block, then it was just like, the self-flagellation would come, and I will never be as good, and I will never finish this. And I just thought, oh my gosh, she's won a MacArthur and she's really upset. But that was her striving for excellence always. And so many of us walk around with this, I have to be better. I can't just be average. I have to be better. And I saw that in what she wrote this all the time, because she was in these spaces she would be the only woman. She'd be the only Black woman. She'd be the only Black person. And she was taller than people, so she stood out, and she was very aware of her outsiderness, but then, she learned, and it took a lot of time for her to create this other persona. I can be Private Estelle, her middle name. But then I'm going to have to figure out a persona, Public Octavia. Who is Public Octavia going to have to be? And then she really leaned into Public Octavia. So that Octavia you see in that beautiful clip of her in the library, that's Public Octavia. So at ease, such authority. She might have gone home that night and been blocked and upset, but you would not have known that,
Oh, that's amazing. I should mention to the people on the Zoom chat, if you have questions for Lynell, you can put them in the chat. And then in a few minutes, we can take any questions from the audience. I did want to discuss a little bit in detail Bloodchild, which for me is one of her most perfect stories, I think, in a very short format. She didn't write a lot of short stories, is that correct?
No, even though, and this is so interesting, and I wish I had known you were going to do this because I would have reread some of them. So they're very, the essays I'm probably more like, because I was just rereading Positive Obsession. But she talked about how short stories, she wrote too long, even though sometimes writing short allowed her to write longer. Like if she could trick herself, like, oh, I'm just going to write something little. And then she would go over and then like, well, I can't be a short story anymore because now it's on its way to a novel size. So it was a trick for her sometimes to just do that.
So for anyone who hasn't read Bloodchild, and if you haven't, I encourage you, after this is over and after you buy Lynell's book, to then look up Bloodchild and read it, because it is really a perfect story, perfect science fiction story, but even more than that, it really is a perfect story. It's about a teenage human Terran boy, or he may be preteen, I'm not sure, but he's younger, and he's on an alien world where humans are kept in a preserve, almost like a game preserve, by their insect handlers / overlords, who are known as the Talik, and described as these kind of massive multi-segmented insectoid creatures. And the story is about him coming to terms and realizing the sort of the true nature of the relationship between the Talik and the Terrans, and his role to play. Butler said that she wrote the story in part to exercise her fear of parasites, and in particular getting infected with a botfly. Is that true? Did she have a fear of bugs or insects or parasites?
She had, well, it's interesting. And again, because the archive is so large, there are little holes I would see, like, oh, I could go down that hole. There's like a whole like folders of her clip files. So medical science, anthropology, and yes, botflies show up in there as is research. And and as I was saying to somebody the other day, I mean, I was like, I'd like to just be able to go back and pick a subject sometimes just to see, like they're so, again, her mind was so, and I was saying that if you look at the pages in the archive, especially the research pages, all of the colors she uses, the different sort of like very personal handwriting fonts that change over time. And what I love about that too is that I realize, like, you again, a map of this beautiful mind. So yes, I can tell you there is botfly research in the archive, and I've seen that written on all kinds of pieces of paper, in her handwriting. But I don't know I did not know what the origin was of that. I just know she was doing research about it, like where it started. I did not know it came from up here.
Oh, wow.
I did not know that.
Wow.
Yeah.
She also was quoted about that story saying that she wanted to explore what pregnancy would be like for a man.
Yes.
And did she ever, now, correct me if I'm wrong, she never had children, is that correct?
No, she did not have children.
Yeah.
No.
Did she, is there anything in the archive, the collection, her papers, where she talks about motherhood and, well, in this case, it's fatherhood in the story, not to give too much away. But it's one of the most haunting and sort of remarkable things about Bloodchild. Did she talk at all about, and also because she had such a strong relationship with her own mother?
Yes. She definitely, the mothers, daughters, grandmothers, that whole, she was close to a grandmother. Writing about women and their relationships with their daughters, that is a theme, in either mothers and daughters together, mothers and daughters separated. But it's funny that on so many, not funny, it's a theme that I see so much in the archive, where she is asked, what are her inspiration? It's always my mother, my grandmother. And, and you see in the books, like with Parable of the Sower, with Kindred, where she is given these women, these very strong, headstrong women who are thrown all these problems, adversity, and they have to figure it out. And in a lot of ways, she says, I based this on my mother and my grandmother, who were struggling in situations that I had to watch them figure out how they were going to get themselves out. So they became role models. And then she's a role model too, because she had to do the same thing. She had to figure herself out of it, out of all kinds of different problems. To answer your question about children, there's a really interesting thread for a while where she is trying to determine if she wants to have children. And it's this, again, one of these dialogues that goes on in the margins or in the middle of something else she's working on. Or she pulls out a piece of typing paper and starts typing it out, like sessioning on it. And she realizes, if I have kids, that's going to be time away from my writing. If I'm going to be a mother, I need to have a partner who's really going to co-parent. My husband is going to have to be present. Will I be able to find someone like that? I'm not sure. Might be better for me to just focus on my and this happens time and again. So, it was something, she thought about, but it was something that writing seemed to outweigh. Like, I'll get to that when I get to it. And then,
Well, and it's also interesting you talk about how important her mother and grandmother were to her, because in that story in particular, the mother figure, who is the enormous Talik insectoid, is not, she's presented in a very complex and kind of multi-dimensional way. A lot of people have read that story and seen it as a parable for slavery.
right.
The slavers, the slaveholders, and the enslaved. And I think you can read it on that level, but apparently, from what I've read, Butler herself said that's a kind of facile or surface reading of the story, because the mother figure, who is the insect Tlik, and the surrogate mother, or in this case father, who is the narrator of the story, have a very interesting and sort of powerful relationship that goes beyond just the overlord and the enslaved. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, she was interested in hierarchies. And and knew that if you took race out of it, humans were going to create some kind of hierarchy. And so a lot of the stories and books deal with that on that level as well, so that there's these tensions between, like, whatever, whoever is like weighing some sort of genetic attribute that has more value than the other in the moment. And so, being human or being alien or being, so she was always playing with power. And as her famous quote is, I write so much about power and hierarchies because I had so very little.
That is fantastic. One of the, and this is going to seem very odd and kind of quirky, but one of the things I love discovering in your book is that you mention the 3-ring binder notebook with a tarnished brass zipper you discovered slipped between the leather and a thin transparent plastic rectangle is a tiny cutout black and white photo, maybe scissored from an old TV log, of young actor Nick Adams, who played the wandering journal-keeping Johnny Yuma, ex-Confederate, sawed-off shotgun-toting troubleshooter in the TV Western The Rebel. I know him from films of like Invasion of the Astro Monster, which was one of the Toho Godzilla kaiju movies, and also he's in Die Monster Die with Boris Karloff. That's such a revealing little, I'm assuming that she put it in there when maybe she was a teenage girl, and
Had to, yeah.
And it was like my wife, and she was like, I put up photos of Duran Duran, the guys from the band, on my wall.
Yes.
Do you think that's what it was? That
I think so. I think so.
A really cute guy, and I keep him in my notebook.
And here's the thing, though. Because I didn't know that series was before my time. So I love YouTube because I thought, well, maybe, sure enough, there are episodes on YouTube. But what really got me was in the opening. There's in one of the, I can't remember if it was in an opening segment. It's a while ago that I looked at this, but he's trying to journal and the pages like blow away. And I thought, oh my gosh, of course she loved this. Of course she loved this. So so it was probably part of what also attracted her to this character. He was journaling everywhere and chasing his pages, But yeah, that's what it seemed like. It seemed like a fangirl. And she would make lists of actors she liked and musicians she liked. And
do you remember some of the musicians that she was?
I wish I could remember. It's been such a long time since I've looked at that stuff. Those are things I was looking at when I was like, I really should be working. But I want to see, who she was. I used to love that she would type out song lyrics. One I remember was Unchained Melody. She would and I think it was her way of practicing typing and listening to the radio at the same time. So there's like a pile of lyrics. I'm trying to think of who's on her list. I will get back to you because I know I have it. It's in my file somewhere.
Here's another quote in your book from Octavia. I made a universe in it. There I could be a magic horse, a Martian, a telepath. There I could be anywhere but here, any time but now, with any people but these.
Yeah.
There is this pervasive sense of loneliness and being apart from the people around her. Can you talk about how that is evident in her journals, in her archive?
Yes. There were some days I was in the archive and it would be a very hard day, of work for her, of getting rejected from her stories, of having some problem that happened at one of her jobs or at school. And and so the journaling was heavy. And she struggled with depression. And on those days, sometimes I would just get too full and I'd have to stop reading. And it's like one of those things I said, I wish I could come from the future to tell you that everything is going to be okay. It's going to be more than okay. But that day, she has just plummeted, in terms, and then she would figure out a way to pick herself up. But, as someone, I was at a conference and we were talking about her one day, and, and people always say, well, she was so ahead of her time and she was so prescient. And, and I've thought about this for a long time about, this gentleman said to me, and imagine how lonely that is. If you are in your own orbit, to your core, things that other people don't see, and they're not listening, they're listening, but they're not hearing, and how lonely that could be. And she, and her interests, and her passions were in things that a lot of her friends did not have interest in. She had to actively work to try to create a community. So when she finally goes to Clarion, the science fiction writing workshop, and studies with Harlan Ellison, that's the first time you start to see that she, even though this is not a perfect community, at least they are tied by subject matter and goals. And so she, even though she's extremely shy, she's starting to wake up and she's starting to fit in. And so you're kind of cheering her on, like, okay, she's finally figured out there are people that she can talk about this part of who she is with. But yeah, it's such a long stretch of like her trying to figure out, how to like find her equilibrium, and how to connect with people. She had friends. She had one of her friends I met, she's known her, I think, since kindergarten. Definitely elementary school. They're very close. She was at one of the exhibition that was at the Huntington, and I was talking to her about, I said, what is this like for you? She goes, it's very strange to see the notebook she carried to school every day in a case, like in a museum case. And she was like, I recognize that. I see her holding it. So she did have relationships with people that were connected to school, and the same friend, they would go to plays, and was a really like amazing correspondent. So she did figure out ways to connect, but it was work, to do that too.
Did she say anything in any of her diaries about studying with Harlan Ellison, and did she enjoy that? Because I interviewed him years ago. You could not kind of imagine two more different personalities.
Exactly.
Brilliant writer.
Yeah.
But he also like sucked all the air out of the room. It was the Harlan Ellison show from beginning to end. And it's fine because he was brilliant and it was Harlan Ellison. But it seems like the solitary, very introspective Octavia and the incredibly sort of brusque, extroverted Harlan would be oil and water. Did she enjoy working with him?
I think they had a very complicated interaction. I think she valued what he was able to do for her, which is hold her into Clarion. Like, he was like, you need to be here. She was like, I can't afford it. He goes, look, I'm going to pay for part of it and you can raise the rest of it. He was insistent that she try. Like, he was, he met her, she applied to be part of this Writers Guild program, the Open Door program, and he saw her talent in that. And then that's what got her to Clarion. And then she started, being part of this small community. And so she was she would talk with him, go to events. But she also very, very early in these journal entries, she figured this out. Like, she's like, he's really not like me. Like, and he would be holding court, and she would talk about all the people that had to be in the room so that he could hold court. He needed an audience. And so it's hilarious. So she would go in the other room and look at his comic book collection or books because she just didn't want to be there for all of that. So there's some very funny things, but she just figured I will take what I need from him and I'll leave what I don't.
Did he help pay for part of her tuition there?
Yeah, part of it. I mean, she raised most of it. And then, you know, because he didn't want her to make the excuse, and he knew, and he was right, that he didn't want her to pass on this opportunity because she couldn't afford it. And he thought it would be incentive for her to do it. So he did. He paid for part of it.
Did she have friendships or correspondence, pen pal friendships with any other sort of significant science fiction writers? Did she feel herself part of that broader community as her work became more and more acclaimed and widely published?
Yes, I mean, there's letters in the archive between her and Ursula K. Le Guin. I'm sorry, Le Guin, and it's so funny because at one point, because they have the K and the E, you know, so sure they both are making jokes about their middle initials, like, please use my middle initial. She's friendly with Samuel Delany, who was her teacher, and then they became friends. Stephen Barnes, she was friends with. I'm trying to remember. I mean, she becomes friends with a lot of people. Vonda McIntyre. So there's correspondence, and then she was good about cultivating relationships with young students like Tananarive Due, who she blurbed, and there are these like wonderful like comments about her. Like, she's like, I just want to encourage her. She's so talented. You know, I know she's making this leap from, because Tananarive was a journalist, and she was making a leap into fiction writing. And she said, I'm trying to figure out ways that I can support and encourage her, because that's a big leap. So yes, she had much more of a community toward the end, or not even like in the middle, you know, it started in the middle, you know.
And do you think that in some ways helped ease her sense of being alone, of being, you know, in such solitude?
Yes.
During her childhood, her young adulthood.
Yes, it absolutely
found a place where she was accepted, respected, honored, and acclaimed.
Yes, absolutely. I think it helped. I don't know if it ever extinguishes all of that early harm, you know, that the wounds, the early wounds, but absolutely. And she talked about at the Black to the Future festival, she talked about going to these early conventions and, you know, being the only Black person, being the only, you know, then there would be 2 or 3 other people, and she'd make a point to say hello. And that was hard for her because, you know, she was not, you know, extroverted. And that's what she encouraged all of us. You know, she said, look at this room, and it's full of artists and writers and musicians and filmmakers and Black people. Look at this room. You know, I could never have imagined that there could be something like this. And she really encouraged us, is like, make sure you connect with people. Make sure, you know, this is a community moment for you. Don't do what I did, you know, and run back to my room, you know. But she saw, and I think I'm so glad again, you know, that those and other things she was able to experience in her lifetime, you know, the adoration, even though I could tell that made her uncomfortable too, because people like ringed around her like she was a rock star. And I could see that was like, okay, it's a little bit too much, you know, she was peopled out, you know.
Right. Did she mentor or teach any younger writers in her, I want to say later years? She passed away at 58, so she was not very middle age. But did she get a chance to mentor any younger writers?
Yeah, she actually started, just like she did with the library, she started teaching at Clarion West. And so I loved looking at, some of her workshop notes and, what she was thinking about assigning. And the writer, science fiction writer, Nisi Shawl was a student of hers. So yeah, they're definitely people who, Ibi Zubi, who else? I just not going to be able to think of everybody, but she made a point to really try to connect with young people because she so needed that when she was coming up. So she did do that. Even when she was very, very busy, she made a point to go and speak at schools and go and do workshops at the library and be on panels, and do Clarion, because she was trying to do the thing for others that she had hoped would happen in her life.
Right. It's a very short quote from her that you have in the book, where she says, "Our stories are supposed to be fiction, our promises are not."
Yes.
Did she realize, I want to say towards the end of her life, but she died very, very suddenly, very abruptly. But did she realize that she had kept the promise she made to herself, that to will herself into the Octavia E. Butler, who won a MacArthur Genius Grant, who wrote these incredible stories, who pioneered and in some ways kind of created a new form of science fiction writing?
Yeah.
Did she know she kept that promise to herself?
Yes, I absolutely think she knew. I mean, she changed the landscape, and she made it possible for other people to be in the room alongside her. And if she hadn't crashed through that wall, it wouldn't have happened. It would have, or maybe it would have happened, but it would have taken a lot longer. And I don't know where she found that persistence, except within herself. It wasn't happening outside. So she had to have seen that. The one thing that, two things happened during, I should say, that happened during the pandemic, or the early part of the pandemic, because we were still in a pandemic, was when Parable of the Sower made it onto the New York Times bestseller list. One of her affirmations, was this list she made all the time about, she wanted to open a school, she wanted to do this, and one of them is like, I want to make it on the Washington Post bestseller list, the New York Times bestseller list, the LA Times bestseller list. None of that happened in her lifetime. She did not make one bestseller list in her lifetime. So the fact that Parable of the Sower made the list in 2020 was amazing and poignant. Like I was like, oh gosh, I wish she was here for this, but then a better thing happened when they named the Mars landing site where the rover landed after her. And I thought, oh my gosh, now that's something she would not have ever predicted. And that one made me cry. That one made me cry.
Brings you to tears. That's incredible.
Yeah, that one brought me to tears. I just thought this one would have just blown her away,
That does. It actually makes me want to cry right now. That's so beautiful. Wow. Yeah. If we have any questions from any of the audience members, Kelly, I don't know if you're still there, if you have received any questions on your end. I probably can't ask anymore because I literally am like near tears now when you just told me. Mars. I didn't know that.
No, I know. I was very emotional. I was trying to explain to my editor, Terry, if Terry's out there, Terry remembers. Terry's like, oh, Terry, she would have just gone crazy, because there's a big part of Parable of the Sower to me, which is what also that Lauren Olamina, the protagonist, she's the very beginning of the book. there's an astronaut, a woman astronaut, who dies on Mars. And Lauren has been following the astronauts, and she said, well, at least she died doing what she wanted to do in a place that was her heaven. And so then there's that too, you know. It just so it's,
I almost want to think you're going to discover one of her calendars someday, and it's going to say 2020. I finally make New York Times bestseller list. 2021. They name us landing
right,
spot on Mars after me. That somewhere
right.
she wrote that. She saw that in the future.
Saw it. Yeah.
Well, I would like to thank you so much. This has been such a magical
Thank
discussion.
you.
Again, I cannot. I'll plug it again because it's so wonderful. Please, I encourage everyone, if you don't have this, buy a copy for your best friend. They will thank you. It's a beautiful, beautiful book. And I would like to thank you enormously, Lynell, for joining us here this evening for this wonderful discussion.
Well, thank you. This was really wonderful. Such great questions. I'm going to have to go and reread Bloodchild because, you know, I love speech sounds. Like that's another, and that's such an LA book as well, about the bus, and just this idea of like, again, here's Octavia brilliantly like using place and situations to, and I don't want to give that away either. But anyway, I just thank you for just your care, and this was a really great conversation. I really appreciate
it was so lovely talking with you tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night, everyone.